Welcome to Onsite with TED. I'm TED. This podcast was originally an internal training tool designed to create a better understanding of today's industry as it constantly evolves. We appreciate you watching. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share.
I'll defy the night. I thought I knew what's right. Every time I tried, it just what was it you did wrong?
Stare at me and wonder what it is you've done wrong. I'll build you up to tear you down, and I'll do it again.
Welcome to Onsite with TED. I have Babesh Ranka here with us. And Dan Arthur from All Consulting. We're going to be talking about some P&A today, regulations, problems in the industry, stuff like that. Babesh, tell us about yourself, man.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, man. I'm Bhavesh Ranka. I'm the engineering manager for CUDD Well Control. Been in the well control industry for around 17 years now, trying to still learn more every day.
That's right.
Graduated from with a master's from Texas A&M Kingsville, and been working with CUDD from 2006.
All right.
That's it.
Master's degree, that was hard to get.
Man, no, not really. Actually, to be honest with you,
It's a
no.
lot of work, dude.
It is, but after doing my bachelor's in India, I actually found doing the master's comparatively easy.
All right. Dan, Mr. Arthur from All Consulting.
Yes, sir.
Tell us about yourself, brother.
Well, I'm a petroleum engineer, about 40 years of experience. Started my career in 1980 with Halliburton, got into the small producing industry, and then when Penn Square Bank went roots up here in Oklahoma, I wound up getting a degree in engineering and went to work for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in Region 5, became an expert there, got into consulting. In 1999, I started ALL Consulting, been the president and chief engineer there ever since. I'm a registered professional engineer in 34 states, an SPE, registered petroleum engineer, certified petroleum geologist, and have been hanging around this industry, and nobody's kicked me out yet.
All right. Behind the scenes, we got our producer, Manny, as always. Please direct your questions through Manny to the chat so that we can handle them accordingly. So what's the difference between plugging a well and abandoning a well? Sometimes you just plug it off. Sometimes we want to just go away from it. So what's the difference between those two?
I'm happy. I don't know who you, I
Yeah.
can certainly take
Go
it.
ahead, Dan.
So typically we'll say plug and abandon, but abandon is one of the things that has created some challenges for us in the United States with a lot of orphan wells where operators have left them, gone bankrupt, and now we got, I don't know, maybe 2.5 million orphan wells that have simply been abandoned by the operators, or the operators went bankrupt or whatever. So a plugged well or a plugged and abandoned well would be one that has gone through that process of being plugged. However, what I'll say is, of the, say, million and a half wells that have been plugged, that definition of what is actually plugged is not real consistent. So we have wells out there that have been plugged, and plugged with brine, plugged with mud, plugged with tree, fence posts, telephone poles. I pulled this out of a well we plugged in Ohio. You can see all kinds of stuff in those wells.
That's awesome.
I would agree with that. We did a well over not far from Houston in a development where this developer was building a retention pond, and he found an old well that was there, and he wanted to cut it. So we hot tapped it, and when we cut the top portion, the top 6.5 feet of it, we found wrenches, old empty cement sacks, and everything in there, and wood, trees, everything you name it, we saw it.
Just whatever they didn't want on
Yep.
location went in.
Exactly.
Wrenches are expensive. I don't know why you throw that away. But
I mean, that one that he showed should be expensive. It's an antique for sure.
That's right.
So
I should, oh,
Dan,
Indiana Jones,
Dan-
it should be in a museum.
then I had a question for you.
Yeah, this one is from a well, late 1800s too, so it's, yeah. But go ahead, what was your question?
Why you said you registered in 34 states? Why did you leave the 16 states? Why not go for all? And how do you keep up with it? Like I have trouble just keeping up my PDH hours with Texas.
So that's a good question, actually. So when, you know, for me, when you look at working in the energy industry, you know, I've got you know, the PE registrations as well as others, and PDH stuff and tests and things. It's a constant effort, and it's not cheap. But you know, if I was working for BP or Shell and just doing stuff internally, I wouldn't necessarily have to have that registration. But for us in our firm, we're a multidisciplinary firm. We work in every oil and gas producing state. I have the SPEC, which also allows me to work internationally, so it's applicable everywhere. So I've drilled, say, like the first shale well in New Zealand. I've done work in China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, et cetera. So you need that too, as well as a certified petroleum geologist. So it's become very necessary, because we never know, you know, maybe you're better at it than I am, but trying to predict which direction the oil and gas industry is going to go at any one time is a difficult task. So it's just, it's been a necessity.
I'm really good at predicting stuff. Just do the opposite of just do the opposite of what I think is going to happen,
That's
and
right.
you'll be good.
That's why you're good at the stock market.
Exactly.
Well,
When
you know,
when I buy, you sell.
That's right.
I have a crystal ball. The problem is it's black and has 3 holes in it, and it never gives me a good answer.
Well, before we get into what your presentation is today, what's the biggest challenge that you see with P&A in the coming years, especially with all the new regulations and then all the money that was just allotted to everybody? There's been a lot of things happen in the last few weeks and months that are really going to affect this. So how is it going to affect the industry overall, not just training or the guys that actually do the P&A?
So I'll give you my opinion, and it, you know, I may not be consistent with everybody, but one of the things I do a lot of is expert witness testimony. So I have testified at maybe 2,500 times as an expert, and what I see is a lot of things happening where people without the necessary experience are out there doing things, or that, you know, that haven't had to struggle through problems. And I think that's really an issue, especially as the industry has developed. So we've developed our industry through kind of unconventionals in more of a factory basis, if that makes sense. So, you know, it's really just like pushing those, you know, wells through. So you talk to, for example, a completion engineer today, he knows how to you know, complete a well and do fracking, but he may not know how to read a geophysical log. And that's a little problematic, but from a well control, from a plugging, from an understanding history, it's an issue. So I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with the Department of Interior and Department of Labor, and one of their big concerns is they're trying to put a lot of money towards, you know, this effort, but they don't believe they have enough skilled people to do that work. So that's a challenge. So training and and so forth is a real big deal. And these days in this arena, it helps if you speak Spanish too.
Quick question, just for clarification. You said a factory basis, or you're talking like cookie cutter assembly line, generic over and over again, same crap, same day?
Yes.
All right, all right.
I agree with him. I think where I see the issues is when the federal government is funding and the funding reaches billions of dollars, you have a lot of companies that want to get a piece of that pie. So you'll see a lot of companies starting and getting in the P&A business. And a lot of these cookie cutter wells or the factory wells, if they are similar, the plug and abandonment might be easier or similar. But what the challenge is getting access to some of the wells where you have to do a critical P&A, where you don't have access to the wells or the wells that have been already plugged. Historically, P&A is when the life cycle of the well ends, and not a lot of thought or money or effort is put into the P&A business, because historically we think those wells are benign wells. You know, the life cycle has been towards the end of it. They don't have any pressures or anything like that. But as more and more wells are drilled in proximity of the existing wells, fracking and everything, you see some of these old wells that have already been plugged or abandoned are charging up, creating more issues. And like Dan said, the lack of training, the lack of experience on some of the people who are trying to attempt this P&A could be a big challenge moving forward.
Yeah, like I've heard, but it's never truth. It's always rumors, right? But I've heard rumors of a well sitting on top of a hill that has a 5,000 wellhead on it, and it's got 6,000 PSI on it, and it's 40 years old. So there's degradation with H2S in it on a hill above a town, right? You never know how embellished those stories are, but it's not too far from, it's believable.
Absolutely. We respond to well control emergencies, and we have responded to quite a few of these wells. So some of the stories you hear are actually true.
So I'll reiterate that, you know, because you're not only dealing with like the issue that you're talking about there, but we're dealing in some cases with, 150-year-old wells or something. But what's happened in that area since then? Has there been, say, a gas storage project, put in place? Is there, what's happened? What's transpired? So there's a lot of considerations that people tend not to think about.
Or, we depleted the zone and now we've got injection wells or saltwater disposal,
or we're going to do CO2 sequestration now, and all of a sudden we start finding new wells out there that didn't get considered.
That's right. That's why it's an estimated number of abandoned wells. Well, you have a presentation to show us, I'm assuming.
I do.
All right.
Let me bring that up. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
All right, so this is, really just, I've tried to keep this pretty brief here. I've done several other, webinars and presentations and all that. So I wanted to keep this quick and just allow conversations here. So, but what I'm trying to address is not only orphan wells, but the issue that we have is, leaking plugged wells, idle wells, which are just non-producers, as well as orphan wells. And we'll talk a little bit more about those, but I'll tell you, you never know what you're going to get. So just like we were talking about, the well on top of the hill or whatever. So, if you look at these wells out in this upper left, Kiefer, Oklahoma, the equipment that you can have. So there's stuff to just getting access and getting in the way. The bottom center picture is a well that I plugged out in the Wabash River there in the Illinois Basin. So, I really didn't think at the time I was started getting into this that I was going to be doing offshore work, but you know, you can't get away from it. So I would just say, you know, as you get into this, understanding what you're dealing with and understanding history, understanding access issues, as well as all the other things that you may have to work with. And when you get into these, especially the older wells, but well plugging, you know, it's you know, there are no two wells that are the same, I'll say. The other thing is just, I'll tell you, it has been a struggle locating wells. So this map to the upper right is something that the Environmental Defense Fund put together. At this point, they had 81,000 orphan wells documented. And this doesn't include, obviously, undocumented wells. And I think they're up, I think between the USGS, DOE, and EDF, they're up to about 150, 160,000 on their map. But one of the things I did in the map in the upper left, this is just a screenshot of some data we've been working on. These are not orphan wells. These are non-producing wells, so idle wells. So if you look at, you know, just here in the, you know, the kind of this mid-continent here, you know, Oklahoma, Kansas, and so forth, you see a pile of wells. But I think the thing that's interesting about this map is if you look at it close enough, you'll see, you know, you can almost see structures, but, you know, you see up at the Oklahoma Panhandle, it just looks like things suddenly cut off. And
yeah, it's like when it gets to Kansas, it doesn't want to work anymore. There's a Wizard of Oz joke there someplace, I'm sure.
that's right. But part of the point there is you can't necessarily believe the data that you see. So, you know, if that bottom left, you know, diagram is an old map, and, you know, it's, you know, that's, I think, from about 1920s. And we had different land grid systems then. They weren't the same. And then you have maybe state agencies who are taking those dots and trying to give you a latitude and longitude so they can put it on some map. And if you think that all those are right, you know, you got another thing coming. I'll tell you, I've done a lot of data management work and so forth. And I will tell you that as soon as you think things are right, then you can go to the state of Montana, because the deepest well in the state of Montana is 100,000 feet deep, according to the database. So as you might imagine, you can't just, you know, blindlessly trust, you know, things that you see in electronic databases. There could be error.
That'd be a big ass rig, man.
Come on, 100,000. We drill them every day.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know, in Oklahoma, the deepest well, I think, was about 34,000 feet, and they stopped drilling when they started producing molten sulfur at a bottom hole temperature of about 350 degrees. So there you go. So just continuing on here, you know, we could go into any number of details, but part of it,
Dan, quick question. You said how deep? 35,000 roughly?
something like that. Yeah.
Were they intentionally drilling for abiotic fluids? And I know that's like a no to talk about in the oil industry, but they're a thing, right? So were they intentionally drilling for abiotic fluids, or they're just like, hey, let's see how far we can push this?
No, they were going for natural gas. So this was, you know, the Anadarko Basin. And I can't remember who the operator was that did that, but there's a lot of deep, high pressure gas out there, and, you know, they were pushing the limits.
All right. Sorry, I was just curious, buddy.
No worries. So if we get back to this, just one of the key things that you see a lot of states doing, BLM, others doing right now, is looking at trying to identify wells. So you have folks taking drones and with magnetometers and gas detectors and, you know, OGI, you know, looking at all sorts of things. But what I'll tell you is those can certainly work pretty well, but looking at historic records and both published and unpublished maps and a variety of things is is really critical. And a lot of the state agencies all around the country have a lot of data. It may not be on a database, but it's certainly accessible. I'll tell you that in some of the wells we found or that we've had to deal with, we've had to go to like local historical institutes to find data on old wells. So it can be a challenge, but there's a lot developing on this right now.
Once again, rumors, not fact, because we haven't put our own eyes on it. But we've been told there are pictures being taken by drones right now going over old wells using infrared scanners.
Yep.
Yep.
Infrared, a variety of different techniques with drones being on there, but it's tough because, like our firm is relatively small. We're about 40 people, but to fly a drone for business purposes, you have to have an FAA license. So we have 3, licensed drone pilots, but there's not enough drone pilots doing this type of work, for instance. That's like another shortage category.
Dan, have you seen or found wells which were not existing in any of the databases?
Oh yeah.
Because that's what we have run into is the operators will tell you what the coordinates are and everything, and you try to find the well and you'll find completely different well.
Yeah.
So I'll give you one example. In southeast Kansas, that's kind of known as slim hole country. So you'd have very small diameter wells that were drilled and installed there. And one of the things that, because I'll tell you, they were drilled very, very close together. I mean, 2-acre spacing or something. And so we found a well, we're going to plug it. Had heard there were other wells in the area, pump nitrogen down the well at the state's request. This was an old oil and gas director, Morris Corpage. And we found 11 other wells within, a rock throwing distance that were not recorded anywhere. So yes, lots and lots of unrecorded wells. But I'll tell you, there are other areas where there's really good data. And I'll tell you, I found, like I was saying, a lot of the historical photos and that kind of stuff can be really helpful.
Dan, I don't know if you want to answer this or not. The wells that you found that were not in any records, what was the regulatory agency's reaction if you submitted a P&A program for those wells? And the reason I say that is I responded to a well which was not in any state records. And when I asked the agency, hey, what's the way to do this? What would you recommend on how to plug this well? And they were like, if you don't know about it, do whatever you want.
Oh,
I will tell you
no
this.
problem.
I will tell you this. I think in 2011, I chaired a National Petroleum Council subcommittee. And one of the tasks that we did, we looked at well plugging and abandonment, and just over, really since the inception of the energy industry, well plugging and abandonment has been a very, I would say, undeveloped arena in just doing that. But so has documentation, just with what has transpired in the past, and even regulation of that. So in the new federal funding, there's money in there to come up with new regulations for plugging and abandonment. So I would suggest to you that to expect new rules coming up for well plugging and abandonment. So currently, we're in the process of doing kind of a best practices for well plugging and abandonment under a U.S. Department of Energy grant. I think that'll go to some use as a reference to a lot of the states. There's several documents out there, but not great consistency. And some of the organizations, like on the federal side, the onshore order, they've got some relatively good detail on this, but but you should also expect that there's going to be more things on, you know, groundwater protection. There's been an emphasis on, you know, protecting underground sources of drinking water more recently. Of course, you know, they only came into, you know, definition in 1982, but none of the regulations really regulate things like methane emissions. So, you know, there's people pursuing carbon credits and all that kind of stuff for this. And, you know, plugging a well so that you can stop those, you know, stop gas methane emissions, as well as fluid flow into USCWs, to the surface, to groundwater, in between, you know, producing formations, etc., potential injection zones. There's a lot to consider. So I would say that if you're not expecting this to get a little bit more detailed as we go forward, you're missing the boat. And there will be a lot of replugging going on too.
Curiosity question. I mean, I understand under the watchful eye of capitalism that there would never be fallacies recorded anywhere for any time period, but is there a specific time period during the industry that the majority of these happened?
I don't think so. I will tell you that, you know, that unlike a lot of the world, the United States is a little unique in the oil and gas industry, is that, you know, anybody on this call can go drill an oil well, you know, and in most of the rest of the world, it's, you know, government controlled oil and gas companies and so forth. So like if you go to Europe, they think that we're cool because we can do that. And so if I go
Somebody
out,
does.
yeah, well, so if I go out and let's say this was, you know, because I've seen it happen today or, you know, 50 years ago, and I go and buy, you know, I'd get a lease for some minerals to do an exploratory well, and I hit a gusher, you know, and now I got to report something. I might say that well is in a different place just so I can go get the rest of the leases, you know. So, you know, there's a lot of things, you know, that were done, and that I wouldn't necessarily go to a particular time frame. But, you know, we look at, I mean, you got to think about this. You know, you guys have heard of the Drake well, right? The first commercial oil well.
That's right.
Do you know when the first oil well was?
There was a rope across a creek, wasn't it?
Nope. 1811 in Kentucky. They were drilling for salt because we need salt. There's all these bedded salts. They get things set up for that, and damn it if they don't hit oil.
All right.
So, you know, you got a lot of old wells. There wasn't regulation. And the other thing, you know, when you really start looking at it, even towards some of this well plugging stuff, you know, Oklahoma's first regulation was the city of Oklahoma City on spacing, where they were saying, hey, only one well per city block in Oklahoma City field, you know. So you didn't have, and that was 1929. So you didn't have a lot of regulation on a lot of the stuff coming up or even starting until, say, the 30s. So, you know, you may have had some sort of statute or something in states like California or something, but there wasn't a lot of that. So, you know, it's hard to say, to make those people out to be bad or that they were doing something wrong. They're just, you know, it was a different time. So you've got to look at it through those historical eyes, not through today's eyes.
Yeah. Well, we got another guy stepping up to the plate in the Homegirls Batters Box, brought to you by the Homegirls Realty Group. What do we got, Manny?
Carlton Land asks, is there a suggested practice for plugging these wells? Depth of cement, ? Amount of cement, ? Type of plugs used, ? Documentation requirements, ?
I've got some examples on some of that stuff. I don't know. You need to flip ahead?
Oh,
Yeah, go.
if it's going to be answered, that's cool. But like back in the day, it was Class A cement. I think it's still.
Oh, I see what you're saying. I didn't understand.
Blame it on Manny, but
Yeah, that's all my fault. I'm sorry about that.
I mean,
Well-
sorry, go ahead, Dan.
I'll say this is, when you say back in the day, and I'm going to talk about this, here a little later, is since you brought it up, when did Class A cement come along?
When Home Depot opens. Is that 7 a.m. I think?
Yeah. Yeah. So I just say, when you start looking at how some of those older wells were built, which is another challenge, and even plugged, the cement was not the same, nor was the casing. So this is another example here. Have you guys all heard of stovepipe casing, for instance?
I have not.
So back in the day, in a lot of the older wells, we didn't have the casing grades and everything, all those details like we do now. And you've got to be able to prepare for that. So we had stovepipe casing, and we're using a lot of wells, especially kind of as your shallow casing. We didn't really call it surface casing at the time, but it might go as far as, say, 1,000 feet, so that you could, that you could do water shut off and make sure that none of that water, surface water, got into your oil zone. But it was a dual riveted piece of casing. 16-inch casing might be 60 or 80 pounds per foot, but you had to perforate them before you put them in the well. In a lot of areas, they would drive that casing, not.
Did you say dual riveted? Like, so you got 1,000 foot of casing? I mean, it's stovepipe, but
That's
it's
riveted.
rivets?
Yeah, like just like you would see the stovepipe, that you would use in your house, except for this is much heavier.
So no real seal, no real tensile strength. No, it was just stovepipe.
So it's, keep in mind, it's not like it's, so this could be 80 pounds per foot. So, it's not like the stuff you have, in your house, but it's very different. So it was used in water wells. It was used in oil and gas wells, primarily for those shallower casings, the shallower casing strings. But this got very popular in areas like California, where they called it California casing. And as time went on, and we got better at making casing, we could have different grades and so forth, and strengths, compressive strengths, collapse, et cetera, that you could know. This got really phased out, but if you go back, you had wooden casings too.
All right. We got another guy stepping up to the plate in the homegirls batter's box. Who's up?
Not a guy, it's Monica.
Sorry, another person.
There you go. Monica asks, in your opinion, would bentonite
Bentonite.
big words,
Just say gel, dude.
would gel serve as a quality P&A material?
So if you look at a lot of the old wells, we're using, she specifically said bentonite, but I would say a lot of the old wells would be plugged with brine or mud laden water. So we can't know now if that was bentonite or something else. Things were called different things now. So like, just as an example, like we talk about barite. Barite in the industry was first called TIFF because a lot of it was mined from Tiff, Missouri. So you had different things, different descriptions and so forth, but it was certainly a method. The problem is that when you're plugging with a heavy brine or mud, often you find problems later on.
Dan, are you referring to like using no cement at all, just using these fluids, or?
So look at this. I'll give you an example in Osage County, Oklahoma. there's some of this in Tulsa, Oklahoma too, and at Turkey Mountain. But what was typically the practice, let's say before 19, and I'm referring here in say the Tulsa area, before probably 1920-ish, if you were drilling a well, you didn't cement casing, you would generally land it. And if you got a dry hole, that would give you the ability to be able to pull the casing out so that you could use it on the next well. And you'd get off of that, fill it with a mud laden water, and fill out a form to send to the state, and it was plugged.
Nothing else, just some water.
Well, so like, let's just say that I would say it could be either one, but say in a producing well, I've seen wells like 1905 plugged with brine in Osage County, where they produced, the reservoir pressure was really low, so fluid level was deep in the well. They didn't, they looked at it just common sense wise, say this isn't going anywhere, so they filled the well with brine and left.
It never seeped in and dissipated, or?
So I would say at the time, no. Are some of those wells problems today? Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. I thank them all the time because I get more work out of it. So
Fair enough. Sorry, we interrupted your.
sorry, Dan.
Good.
Oh, no worries.
Took a left turn there, Clyde.
The other thing I'll just say is that, one of the things that gets ignored a lot within a lot of these old plugging stuff is risks. And, we're all, it's a well-controlled school here, so we get that. But, I have to tell you, I've done litigation cases as an expert witness where we had welders that didn't realize that methane was flammable and they shouldn't maybe do things there without checking. There could be a lot of hazards. We've seen wells being plugged in schools, under houses, all sorts of different places. So, and realizing, what risks could be there is just very, very critical. So I would just encourage anybody getting into this that there may be more complications than you may anticipate. So this picture is from Ohio, and it's an apartment complex, and there was some wells under there, and they had to install something to vent, but people were complaining and getting sick and so forth, and we can have all sorts of problems that we might not anticipate. I love this one. Just, this is out of a well drilling methods resource book from 1911, that picture up to the right, talking about, how to drill wells. And these were, so you had oil wells in America drilled using this technology. And sometimes, it's, these things can get drilled in the oddest of areas. So when you start thinking about how some of these old practices were done, and then, this well at the bottom right is about that's one in southeast Ohio, maybe southwest Pennsylvania, I can't remember, but it's like a 1870s vintage well, and that's what you're looking at. So you can imagine if you're going to go, try to do a plug job on that, how long is it going to, how much you're going to spend, how long is it going to take just to clear stuff up to get out there? It can be, it can be a hoot. The other thing I'll say is that what I've seen, and I'd say there's been, I'd say have been a pretty large issue, especially in the Northeast, but in a lot of places, is stray gas migration, vertical migration. This is an issue even offshore. So we're doing some work with the University of Oklahoma on looking at offshore plugged wells. where you're having gas migration coming through a cement, or cement decoupled from casing or formation, and so forth. So I'll tell you, the products that we use, how we plug the wells and so forth is really critical. There's a couple of new cements that have come out now, where they're using more limestone. One of the problems with that is those cements aren't generally as effective at stopping gas as some of the others. So cement design and laboratory analysis and so forth is critical in this.
Now, curiosity, you're not the first person that I've heard say the Northeast. Like, every time you hear something like really, really weird, or I was doing a case study and they killed a well using mercury, and I was up in the Northeast. Why is the Northeast, and I'm making an assumption because the East Coast was more populated back then, but why is the Northeast so much more with the weird stuff?
I don't know that it's necessarily the weird stuff, but one of the things that you get into in, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Maryland, and so forth is, is the geology. So you have a lot of intermittent or a lot of intermediate gas zones. So there's a lot of those, a lot of shallow gas zones, and a lot of historic unconventional development, you got wells up there that were plugged with lead, banging lead in there. There was a lot of, just when they were completing wells, they're in that Bradford field, a lot of nitroglycerin used, and, torpedoes to do that local fracking. I mean, so there was a lot of experimentation. And, I live in Oklahoma, and Tulsa was the oil capital of the world there for a while. And what you see is, even here, a lot of the people that developed the like the Glenpool oil field and Red Fork and all that around here were from Pennsylvania.
Did you say torpedoes to frack?
Yes,
That you can't just keep talking past that. That's cool shit.
that's what they called it. So they would fill these pipes with nitroglycerin and then drop something on to set them off. So it was, it was essentially fracking. I successfully been able to argue that in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and saying that it was we do fracking now. We look at it with pump trucks and all that, but they did the same thing then. It's just with a different energy source.
Manny, what does that say in the chat? Mike just sent something.
HG equals 112 ppg.
And it still flows?
Huh?
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, talk us through this one, buddy.
So I'll just say this, and I don't want to take up, bore everybody here, but just understanding history is critical. We've been talking a lot about that. Realize that API wasn't founded until 1919. Most states didn't even have regulations until the 30s. Practices have varied so substantially, even in how we did things and do things, and you've got some of these old books from the Bureau of Mines or wherever that have some, would probably shock you if you saw some of the things they had in them.
That's a question I got, and I just kind of spurred in a moment. Like, here in Texas, it's the Railroad Commission, right? Because we didn't have a regulatory body for it, so it all fell under the railroad. Do you think that was some of the original problem?
I don't know why you say it's a problem. It was just it was a different time. So for instance, you put casing in, shallow casing in to keep water from getting into an oil zone, because if you let that water leak into or flow into an oil zone, it could reduce the amount of oil you might produce. And at the time, the state was responsible for doing the best with those resources. So
I may have misspoke. I was saying problem for record keeping of where these wells actually are.
So, gee whiz, so, in 1999, I've done a lot of database work for a lot of state agencies with the risk-based data management system. I don't know if you guys have heard of Frac Focus, but, I'm the guy who put that together. But in 1999, we did a database, went to help the Arkansas Oil and Gas Commission do their first database. Before that, their database was Microsoft, or no, it was WordPerfect. And that was 1999. Okay. So, record keeping and so forth, that's we've come so far, and to be able to think about record keeping, in 1900 or even 1950 from how we do things today, it was just vastly different. So I'll tell you a little bit, just the other thing that I think is important to understand is, with the Safe Drinking Water Act and the development of the underground injection control program in 82, that's when the definition of underground source of drinking water first came about. So it was through that UIC program that came about. So before then, the thought of protecting groundwater was less of an issue. We looked at maybe protecting water from, say, for irrigation, but the definitions of how things were done were very different. If you go into some of the old records, I have this at the bottom where it might have something where you're looking at water to protect or not to protect. It might be, the driller saying, hey, it tastes salty. That was it. I mean, you just didn't have anything else. I'll get over here. This is interesting, as we've been talking about, what the problem is, even whether it's record keeping or how things were done. But in 1922, we had a petroleum industry handbook done, and part of the standards in that handbook were using wooden plugs, and like I said, lead plugs, or setting off nitroglycerin. So there's a lot of wells that were just were plugged in a variety of ways that today we would just see as astounding. And I talked about this a little bit before, but I will tell you the potential hazards here. I don't know how many people on the call have been on well blowouts with plugging old orphan wells, but it's real. I'll just say things happen, and don't think that, because a lot of people will take these wells and just think, oh, it's some old well, I just got to pull up and dump some cement, and be done real quick. And boy, you can have some surprises, and so. And the other thing is, and I've got something else to show. So this top left picture is this from a well up in Ohio, old well, being plugged, and when you think, say, you're plugging an old well that's maybe 100 years old, you have to realize that as you go in there, that casing that you see on that permit or whatever it is, that documentation may not be like, in the condition that it was when they put it in there. And I'll tell you, so I got another thing here. So this is part of an old wooden sucker rod. So you guys may have seen some of these, but this is about a 1890s well, came out of an old well in Appalachia. And if you could just, see the corrosion of that. I'm sure everybody here has seen corroded stuff before, but I can't tell you how many times I approach some of these, and you'll have an engineer, geologist, whoever it is a plugging company who will look at the diagram and think everything is going to be just like they put it in yesterday. And that is not the case. The other thing, and I'm getting close here to the end, but the other thing I'll say is that there's a lot of new products out there. You know, we've used resins, microfine cement. There's some, you know, biomineralization technology. This is one from BioSqueeze. We've used their stuff, and I've really liked it because it's, you know, this is stuff that can fit in a microannulus and stop gas flow. So it's a positive thing. So I'll tell you, I've got some other, you know, examples of, like, you know, well plugging stuff, but that's really what I've got, unless you want me to flip through some diagrams to show you wellbore plugging diagrams that sound kind of boring to me. So
Oh, no, we're all right. We got some topics that we could go over here real quick. And one of the biggest things that I want to know from you and Bhavesh, like, so with today's technology, we're learning how to drill farther, drill deeper, a lot more open hole through a lot narrower windows, right? And yeah, we can do it, we can drill it, but eventually one day that well does quit producing and we're going to have to P&A it. So how does today's initial well design, like what they're doing today, going to affect both of you later in life, or maybe our kids? I don't know. Depends on how long it runs, I guess.
I mean, I don't think, like I said earlier, historically P&A, you don't plan wells for how you're going to plug them, right? So the challenge is whether it be how deep they are, how far they are, what kind of chemical composition you would need with the cements and everything. I don't think people have thought that far. So I think that it's going to be a challenge, because we are still dealing with the challenges from the wells that were plugged in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, and 40s, where using the best technology at that time, the wells are leaking now. We responded to a blowout last year where a well that was plugged in the 40s had salt water flowing about 100 feet in the air. So
It's got some push to it.
exactly. And like Dan had mentioned in his presentation also, the record keeping or how the wells were plugged in, what's on documentation to what actually exists is completely different. We did a plug-in well, we plugged a well in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I don't know, Dan, I'm not picking on Tulsa, but somehow Oklahoma comes up every time. This well, this homeowner in his front yard smells gas that's leaking. So he calls a utility company. Hey, maybe it's your pipeline that's leaking. They come and they check, and no, it's a well. So we find the records and it shows there should be this casing at this depth. But when we start excavating, there's no casing.
It's just a hole.
It had 2 7/8 tubing, about 10 feet off it. That's
That-
it. That's it. That's the hole. That's it.
that was the basic practice. So you had a lot of uncased holes. You know, I'll tell you, we have an issue right now where there's an REI store getting ready to put in a new store here in Tulsa, and they've done a phase 1 environmental assessment, but you know, a lot of environmentalist consultants don't know to look at old historic records. And from what I got, they got 4 to 6 old unplugged orphan wells under where they're planning to put a building.
Are you going to help them plug those wells, Dan? Or
I have notified them and offered.
give me a shout out, man.
So with everything that's happened in the last month and all the money that was allotted and do you guys see stricter regulations coming from either state regulatory bodies or federal regulatory bodies?
From what I understand, the federal funding has a bunch of strings attached to it. So
Surprise, the government wants something.
So the new federal funding includes funds for new regulatory development in states and for the federal government as well. So that's coming.
Okay. So if you take the money, you have to abide by these set of rules, not necessarily what the state says, but what the government says.
One of the challenges that the current funding, this is why things are moving slow, is the feds put in a kind of a clawback clause. So they have the ability to evaluate what you did and how you did it. And if there's an issue, they could actually pull back some of the funding. So the states are kind of negotiating, I'd say, with the federal government right now on that, so that they don't want to spend money and then have it taken away.
Right. All right. Well, then one of those stupid sayings that's actually holds true for all of eternity is, you know, if you fail history class, you're doomed to repeat it, right? If you don't learn from our past mistakes. So we were talking, you know, about the way we're designing wells today is how do we fix that disconnect, right? So that we do have a greater success and a better chance of P&A in these wells eventually in the future. Is it
So
education? Is it well design?
can I throw a couple of things out there?
Absolutely.
So one of the challenges we have even now is, as we go back and try to look at wells and well completions, you know, you have information that's reported, but for instance, if you want to know what additives were in cement and so forth, a lot of times there's a lot of details that never get reported. But there was a term that I learned when we were, you know, working up in Appalachia and early in the unconventional fracking biz up there, and there were a lot of cases of you know, gas migration, and there was a movie made with guys, you know, setting their water faucet on fire that you might remember. But
Yeah.
one of the issues, you'd have these guys that were working in, say, the Barnett Shale, coming up to Appalachian thinking it was the same thing, and I learned this little handy saying is that this, you know, have you ever heard the term TAFT? TAFT?
This ain't Texas.
Let's stick with that.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering, what does the F stand for?
You may pick whatever adjective you choose to insert.
Got it.
Come on, man, spit it out.
Question for Bhavesh, and I probably you too, Dan. What's the biggest well control concern that you guys see out there?
For me, complacency. Like people, P&A is an afterthought, right? Like, hey, you drilled the wells, you produced it. No one cares about the P&A as such. But when it comes down to actually plugging it, and now especially with the amount of money that's involved, everyone wants to get in the P&A business. And you think of a P&A well, it's a benign well, it's reached its end of life. So there could be no pressure, there would be no flow or anything from the well. So for me, the biggest thing is when people try to P&A the wells, when they try to gain access into the well, are they taking all the precautions necessary to ensure there is no pressure? There could be no flow.
They're just opening it up to the atmosphere and seeing what happens.
We responded to an event last year where this orphan well contractor plugging is like, we have a slight leak. And I was like, sure, we can help you with that. And he sends me a video, and sure, it was a leak. It was flowing pretty good.
No, just a slightly.
It's just a slight leak.
Okay.
And luckily, you know, they were about to move the rig in. Think of it like, you know, if you have a wellhead or a piece of casing or something like that, you don't know what kind of pressure would be trapped behind a wellhead or something like that if you cannot monitor it. So when you gain access to it, just to figure out what's going on, what pressure could be there. Again, like I said, you know, people think P&A is an afterthought.
Well, if you're leaking, you got any kind of AIN or EAN or something like that, right? Like you're bringing a ignition source to the leak.
Absolutely. Look at the way I look at it is like a well-controlled company interested in P&A. Why is that? Because we have seen incidents like that. Last year, I think we responded to at least 3 or 4, if I remember correctly, of wells which were plugged, which were leaking. We have P&A scheduled in the next few months on wells which were already plugged that might be leaking or might have pressure on it. There's a stub of casing sticking from a ground. What do you do? And I'm sure Dan has more examples like that.
And what do you attach a BOP to? Are you going to drive some casing around there? And I mean, it's just, there's so many things. So, some of the studies out there suggest that 25 to 50% of the plugged wells are leaking, and so there's been a lot of work done in Canada on that. And I think they're at about 24%, something like that, of their plugged wells that leak. So there's a bunch of issues, but even going into these old wells and making sure that you have something to be able to set up well control, and people experience to know what to do. I'll tell you, some of the other issues is just things like swabbing. And I mean, there's all these little things that people take for granted. And I'll just throw out this last thing that I'll say, as I do a lot of expert witness stuff, and generally the issues where I see problems is either the very non-experienced guy or the very experienced guy who just, thinks he knows everything.
Yeah, 3 to 5 years or 40 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
What I just got from this answer is I'm going to be busy for the next few years. For sure.
That's right. Well, maybe can you guys help me clarify some things? Because there's everybody, like, P&A seems simple enough, but terminology, it's like when you get into Reisler's intervention, right? So there is an orphan well, there is an abandoned well, and then there are zombie wells. How are those classified?
Then you want to get this, or you want me to start?
Go ahead. I'm tired.
Come on now. Orphan wells would be the wells where you cannot find the owner of the wells, right? Like, basically, historically, what happens is as companies mature, they try and sell the wells to different companies. And what happens is the state will, or if there's any issue with it, the state or the regulatory agency would try to come back and find who the last standing owner of the company of the well is. And if those company exists, they will take care of it. Or the owners will fall on them to take care of it. But if they go to the chain and cannot find anyone who's standing or as a company exists, it becomes an orphan well where there is no ownership and the regulatory agency has to take care of it.
Okay. All right.
Zombie wells, that's a new term that's been developed. I cannot comment much on that. But I think what was meant on that was wells that were plugged or have been dormant for years suddenly are coming back to life.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, just because
a zombie would.
Just because a well was abandoned just meant it was not viable to continue to try to produce it at the time, right? Doesn't mean that we depleted that zone. We just may not want to change out the junk at the bottom.
Exactly. And especially now that if you're fracking or if you have injection around it, now we're inducing pressure into it.
Yeah. And all of a sudden it came back to life. Yeah.
Just
I
like
love
zombie.
oilfield tools. They tell you what they do. It's pretty
Absolutely.
All right. Well, how do you see plugging techniques changing in the future? I mean, with new regulations, with funding, with everybody's eyes on it, with all the ESG garbage that's coming out, with all the media coverage that it's getting, what do you see changing in the future for the techniques of this? Obviously, I'm hoping cement, but
Absolutely. I think any kind of downhole isolation tool, whether it be cement, resin, or whatever we can do, and then training. Understand the seriousness of the issue and not just be like, hey, this is an old well that's not producing. Let's just abandon it for now and we'll come back to it later on. So it might not be an issue for my lifetime, but could be an issue later down the years.
yeah, we're fixing our father's sins, right? Our grandfather's sins, honestly.
Right.
I will tell you that there's a lot of work going on looking at the possibility of repurposing wells. You know, so there's a good bit of things on that, but also even, you know, the plugging materials, the, you know, how to plug and so many more considerations of what an area might be used for. So for instance, if you're going to be in an area where there might be a, you know, a CO2 sequestration project or a geothermal project or something like that, you need to make, or even, you know, with what's happening today is, you know, we've had induced seismicity, which has really moved a lot of the water disposal from, say, deeper zones to shallower zones. And what's happened as a result of some of that is you're having unknown orphan wells that say aren't plugged or whatever, that or old plugged wells that weren't plugged very well, that are becoming those zombie wells. You know, so there's, I would just say there's a lot more attention coming to this, and this has been an entire thing that really has not gotten the attention of the industry, and it's getting the attention of the industry. So I have a feeling there's going to be a lot of great changes, a lot of good things that are going to come about here.
All right. Well, I got two guys here that spend more time in school than I even ever thought about doing. So, and you guys both have tremendous amounts of field experience. Being an engineer, being in the field, actually putting your hands on these things, what type of engineering constraints do you see as adhering to when planning a plugging program? Like, if I'm going to go P&A a well, I've got to do a risk assessment, obviously, right? But what kind of engineering goes into that to be able to do it? I mean, and does that include training as well?
Personally, for me, when we are designing a plugging operation, what we design based on obviously the safest approach to gain access, plan the operations, but more so as how do we plug this well? So 15, 20, 30 years down the line, it doesn't become a zombie well and come back at you. So what can we do to plug it right and plug it once? Obviously, we don't have the crystal ball to know what things could
It's got
change.
holes in it anyway, right, Dan?
Yeah, the black crystal ball with holes in
That's
it, right? So we don't know that. So, but at least from an engineering standpoint, is plan it in a way where, based on today's technology, based on today's available tool, we do it in the best possible way to prevent it from coming back to us down the line.
Can I throw one more thing out there? And
Absolutely.
I'm going to have to run here in a second, but one of the things that has been a real problem with well plugging is that we tend to want to look at this on an individual well basis. So when we go out and develop an oil field, you know, we look at the structure and the trap and all this and plan different wells. But it seems like from a perspective of how our industry is attacking this, is when we look at well plugging, we look at one well at a time. When in reality, we might go to a field and say, hey, there's 250 wells here, all that need plugged. And the most efficient and effective way to do that is to mobilize one time and address all of those. And you could have some savings, make sure that things are done properly and so forth. So, you know, there's a lot coming.
All right. Now, do either one of you, before you, I know we're running a little late today, do you see any other uses out there for the wells that we've been plugging? Just because it's not viable to produce hydrocarbons anymore doesn't mean it's not useful, right? So are they plugging it just because it's cheaper, or is there other things that we could be doing with these wells?
Absolutely. I think that there are a lot of companies trying to repurpose this wells, whether it be from a geothermal to conducting or to being disposal, injection, and any of the other uses. For sure, there are companies who are trying to repurpose them, even as
So
energy storage.
I would throw beyond that is water supply wells. But also there's a big effort being looked at around the country now for mining lithium. So if you look at the Smackover field in lower Arkansas, it's a ripe potato for lithium. And so, you know, we've been looking at some of those old wells to see if can we produce, you know, the Smackover, not for oil production, but for its water, so we can extract lithium.
It's more of a, like a washout really, right? You just water flooding and dissipate it, get it to surface and then separate it, right?
Just that water production, not even a water flood, just producing the water from the Smackover.
All right. Do you think we're going to see new changes in the laws on how we're allowed to abandon them? So like if I lose an LWD in the hole, and we know there's a nuclear source in it, and I've got to make, you know, X amount of attempts and then beg for forgiveness and right? So do you think the laws on how we can just abandon a well or we're done with this well are going to change?
You're getting ready to have a lot of changes in bonding, I'd say, in every state and with the Fed. So I'm going to say that you're going to start seeing a lot of changes, because what historically has happened is some big oil company goes in and develops something, and they sell it to a smaller company who sells the assets to a smaller and smaller company, and then they go bankrupt and you're done. And you know, that's, you know, we're seeing a lot of talk and a lot of changes coming on bonding and being able to do that, and just a variety of different things.
Do you see that state by state first, followed by federal, or do you see it federal and then the states embellish on it?
It's going to be a little bit of both.
There is some innovation happening from an insurance perspective too, where instead of bonding, the companies they're going to start offering insurance products that would take care of the bonding requirements.
You got to explain that one to me.
So basically, you buy insurance that would take care of the bonding requirements, as in the insurance company would either take care of the plugging down the line when it comes time to plug it, or give you an X amount of dollars based on what kind of a policy you bought to plug the well in future.
All right. So if you abandon it, they're not taking ownership of it.
They can. There are products like that which could, or there is a product which they would take the ownership of the well.
There's not a lizard involved, is there?
No.
Okay.
Hey guys, this was great, but I have got to run. So thanks everybody.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate your time, brother. All right. I guess we'll open it up to the chat for questions. What do you guys have?
That's just about right. Like sometimes the question and he just bails off.
Yeah, no.
What I usually get from my classes, especially like when I'm teaching out in Odessa, they're always asking, like, is there like a set recipe that most people are going with to P&A well? So minimum depth of the well, minimum amount of cement to a certain formation, then filling the well up back either with fluids or whatnot. Is there something that you guys are kind of going by, or almost the set industry standards you guys are seeing out there?
We try to follow the state regulations for it. Like every state has their own regulations. So we try to follow those and better those if we can. So like one state in Northeast has, in their plugging requirements, you're supposed to use Class A cement.
It's still in their requirements.
It's still in their requirement. They're okay with using Class A. And so we try to better that and, use the appropriate cement.
So is there something in regulation where they come back 50 years and do it again?
I guess, I don't know.
Right.
Good for my business. Like I said, hey, I'm not complaining too much till I have to pay for it. So,
well, what kind of cement do you prefer, or resin or mechanical?
It depends on the formation, the depths that we are using. So we work with our cementing department to come up with a recipe which is the most appropriate for that. Now, obviously, it's not cheap, and we don't want to go overboard, but you just find a happy medium where the cement you use would be the right kind of cement for the next few years. I say few, but for the rest of the life, at least my life.
At least ours, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Michael has a question. a lengthy one. Let's get started.
That must be McBride.
No,
Oh, all right.
I don't want to insult him, so I'm not gonna try to pronounce his last name.
Mr. Marishik.
There you go. I was gonna say something completely different.
Okay.
Cost is always the driving factor. Cheapest bids get state contracts and they cut corners to make budget. Regulatory body supervision on location isn't capable of telling differences between gray water and cement. The execution is terrible. How do we get better, more regulation?
Ooh, that's a good one.
More better regulation. I'm not sure if I'm for more better regulation, but I think more oversight is what I would say, where
Not micromanagement.
I love micromanaging. Come on, dude.
No, fair
No,
enough.
no. I think I lost the freaking. I missed
Better regulations. How do we
Yeah,
get
yeah.
better regulations?
So I think the regulatory agencies are coming up with regulations to ensure, because at the end of the day, if they cannot find the rightful owner of the wells, they have to pay for it, for an orphan well. So it comes out of their funding. So obviously they want to make sure that this doesn't happen. So they do come up with regulations, but I think the problem is with the funding being so tight, they have to, and the way the tenders work, they have to go with the lowest bidder. But I think having an experience component on it, like how many wells has this this company has plugged, what is their experience level, what is their training level, would help a lot in preventing an event or preventing a plugged well coming back to life.
So if they're concerned about getting more bang for their buck, right? If I can P&A 100 wells for X amount of dollars, but I could P&A these wells, say 20 for the same amount of money, they're going to do the 100 because it makes them look
Absolutely.
better, right?
Yeah, absolutely. They have metrics to meet too.
Oh yeah. Well, cops don't have quotas either, right?
I cannot say that. I have to drive 50 miles home. Am I going to take it if
If you get
something?
pulled over in Houston, you were doing something really stupid.
You haven't seen my driving, so
Fair enough. I'll tell you what, we'll go to my house. I'll race you.
I don't know.
We got anything else in the chat?
Michael, did that answer your question though?
There, actually, Mike, just jump on.
Hey guys. Hey Bobby, Tony. Yeah, I mean, look, it's always the problem, right? It's cost, and I've been on location. I've done plugging myself, and they're mixing cement with essentially a shotgun hopper, right? So there's no quality control on what gets placed anyway, and the railroad commission representatives, those guys make $30,000 a year, and they're first year interns. So I'm not a proponent of more regulation, but they got to put some cash in the pot to get proper supervision out there to make sure it gets executed. Because even if you isolate every groundwater and every formation with proper cement, if it's not put in the well correctly, it doesn't do you any good. So
are you suggesting we have kind of like BLM has, right, where they have well-paid representatives that come out, or Bessie?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, that's probably the solution, and NMOCD is historically harder to get along with than RRC, and I don't think I've touched anything Oklahoma or Colorado, but at least at some level, the plug-in job is good for another 50 years at least, right?
Yeah. Well, hopefully. So this had to come from somewhere, and I know your background and your history of what you've done in the field, and I know you've seen some really weird shit. So where did this spawn from, or why do you see this need as extremely important right now?
Oh, I got wrapped up in a deal that was pro bono a couple years ago, and railroad commission guy was out there, and they had some circulation issues, and they were outside the casing, and just flat couldn't get a plug, and they bled a small guy to death, and then you see some other majors get away with gray water, and that's really what it is. So I don't know. It's we have a responsibility as representatives of the oil and gas industry to do better. I just don't know where that line is. I can't stand the government either, but we really all have.
Well, I'm making an assumption here that the little guy can't afford to pay it off, whereas the big guy can.
Right, but I think, and
Fair enough.
I understand your point, Michael. It's just you want to. The thing is, I guess the regulatory agencies are trying to do the best with whatever funding they have, and for them, whatever their matrix may be on how to meet those, whether they plug 20 wells at an X amount of dollars or they plug 100 wells at the same amount of dollars. Not a lot of the regulatory agencies cannot. They do not have the money at this time to plug the wells like an operator would do. And I think that's why they try to find the last standing owner to see if they would fund the P&A applications. So I think that's where the bonding requirements, the insurance and everything would come into play down the line, where there is adequate funding for it and the wells could be plugged properly.
Yeah, well, I mean, if we tax everything else, right? If you're going to make money off of a well, X amount of that should go in like a well has a 401k for its retirement, like there's got to be something that can be done.
I mean, this would be a good topic for your next one of these Fridays. We have a guy on the cementing group who loves cement, and he can talk about different kinds of cement.
I'm actually looking for an offline cement guy.
So yeah, talk to him, and the guy, I mean, I love my job, but I've never seen someone love their job so much like he loves it. He loves cement. He lives and breathes cement.
Man, that stuff's cool.
So we for one operator, we designed the slurry where I think the cement itself was like about 80% of the cost of the actual P&A on a critical well. I mean, and the operator was like,
cement isn't that expensive.
This was expensive. Trust me, this was expensive. You know what I charge.
Yeah.
And when I say it was expensive, it was expensive.
Fair enough.
And the operator rep was like, I do not want to come back to this well because these wells were already plugged before. They were sold multiple times, but this operator was the last standing operator which had any funding. So it came back, the liability came back and fell on them.
For how long? 10, 20, 30 years?
This well was, I think from the 40s.
Okay.
And was plugged in the 60s, maybe.
All right. Well, P&A lasted for a while.
I don't know if it lasted for a while or not, but they found out now.
What you got, Manny?
Ryan says, we have talked about land P&As, but how many old orphaned wells are offshore?
A bunch.
You can't see them
Yeah,
under
but I
the
mean,
water.
I can just say bunch. I mean, I don't have the numbers, but we have been contacted about some wells where you literally see holes in the casing. The people fishing around those old platforms, they see gas leaking, and they're like, "Hey, there's a gas leaking," and that's how we found the leaks, because these are unmanned platforms, abandoned.
Have you ever run those dark vision tools in to see what's going on? So what you need to do, or you just worry about the entire wellbore?
Yeah, we worry about the entire wellbore. But like, I mean, I'm not too sure about the dark vision tools.
It's nothing like a CAT scan for your well.
Yeah, we've run cameras, we've run X-rays at surface.
All right. Fair
So
enough.
we've done some cool stuff.
Well, I would like to thank Bhavesh for being here today with CUDD Well Control. Appreciate you. And our sponsors, the Homegirls Realty Group for Keller Williams Northeast. If you're looking to buy a house, give them a holler. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time. We would like to thank you for watching. I'd love to give a special thanks to Manny, the producer, and Scotty, the director, for all the hard work they put in. Nobody gets to see. Please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you once again, and we'll see you next time.